welcome to another edition of Key News. I'm Jim Lesko. I'll be your host today. As most of us know, the country's had a major problem with foreclosures, our economy, lost jobs, and we don't even know part of the story. And today, I hope to have some of that cleared up for me and made available to us by Frank Morris is here to join us from Western Mass Legal Services. Frank, thank you for joining us.
Jim, thank you very much for having me. It's a privilege to be with you today.
And let me just start by asking, I know you're an Eastern Mass kind of guy, and how'd you end up out here in Western Mass with the legal services?
I've always had an interest in practicing law in Western Massachusetts. After law school, my wife and I looked in the Pioneer Valley for opportunities. For a number of reasons, we stayed in the Boston area, Eastern Mass area. But now that we're empty nesters, an opportunity arose. The Massachusetts Attorney General gave a grant to Western Massachusetts Legal Services to hire one mortgage foreclosure prevention attorney for 1 year to cover the 4 western counties. I applied, and I was fortunate enough to be retained to take on those responsibilities. That was my first days on the job were the end of April 2010, and I'm just about to wrap up my 13th month. They've stretched it out, saving on Xerox and postage and phone to have me on for another month.
So let me ask you, that you said 4 counties.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that would be Hampden, Berkshires, Franklin, and Hampshire, correct?
That's correct.
All right. That's a large, one, geographical area, and 2, the diversity that lies within those counties, from large cities such as Springfield to small hill towns, Russell, Blandford, etc. What was your first impressions when you started looking into this issue of foreclosure? What were some of the findings that you came away with? I mean, were you surprised by any of the data that you were finding?
Well, first of all, I knew that it was going to be a formidable task. Geographically, it's a large area. Municipalities are very diverse, from Springfield to the smallest towns. But the most striking feature for me was the large number of elderly and the large number of veterans who were facing foreclosure. There were a number of elder vets who were facing foreclosure. And what I've found over the last year and a little bit more has been that foreclosures are one paycheck away or one reduction in income away. And elders, I think, are facing 2 things. First, there may be a loss of a spouse, and that will reduce Social Security benefits, may reduce veterans' benefits. There may be an illness, which is, as we all know, more prevalent in the elderly community than otherwise.
And more costly these days.
More costly, that's true. And so money that's going to pay for medical care, pharmaceuticals, is not going to the mortgage. And those, to my mind, are the principal reasons that the elders and the veterans are facing foreclosure in larger numbers than I anticipated by far.
Okay. And, when we were talking earlier, you said, I asked, is there an aggregated number? And you explained that's a very hard process, where one may fall in the line of foreclosure, whether it be the early notice of a late payment all the way down to a process of hearing that may be in. So that number is always a little bit elusive. Can you just touch upon, what kind of, in our own communities here, what kind of size is this problem? How big is it?
It is very large. It's difficult to put precise numbers on it because of the process that you've alluded to. There are undoubtedly thousands of homes in Western Massachusetts that are facing foreclosure or have faced foreclosure, gone to auction, and the homeowners are no longer owners of their own properties. Sometimes the foreclosures were based upon predatory loans, loans that should never have been given to individuals.
Okay.
Most often, as I mentioned a moment ago, the foreclosures are due to economic factors. Someone has lost a job. Someone's hours at their job were reduced. I had a couple in Franklin County come to me. He is a truck driver. She works in a manufacturing facility. Both of their hours were reduced. The total monthly income, he estimated to me, was reduced by 25 to 30%. As a result, they were facing foreclosure. Fortunately, we were able to get a loan modification. He was a veteran. The Veterans Administration participated to some extent in getting the loan modification. But to be very candid, I found the Veterans Administration, their regional office in Atlanta, was really a month or two behind what was transpiring in Massachusetts, in Franklin County. And it took the VA weeks to get caught up to where we were. The numbers are large when you spread them out on a piece of paper, but it's extremely large if it's an individual family.
Okay.
100% of that family's home is going to be foreclosed. 100% of those people, mother, father, children, in that home are going to be homeless in a week or two or month or two once this foreclosure auction process runs its course.
Well, can I ask you a question then? And,
Sure.
and maybe go back a little bit. Predatory practices, I believe is what you called it, right? And there is different levels of understanding of this, and it's very complicated. It can be very complicated. Is there a way of understanding it for the average viewer of both the traditional way of getting a mortgage, the non-traditional way, and where this problem came, how did this come about, and how did it in such a large manner across the country, not only in Western Mass? Is there, I know that's not an easy question, but is there a way of describing that?
There is a way of describing it. It's just how far back do we want to go? The lending institutions and the process of lending for homeowners became more and more deregulated in the 90s and the first decade of this century. Companies who were offering loans got into the business of no-doc loans. Homeowners were not required to provide any documentation on some of these loans. Didn't
Basically
have to prove
proof,
any
yeah.
income, didn't have to prove any assets, didn't have to show what they paid in taxes last year or this year. These no-doc loans are sometimes known in the industry as liar's loans. We'll fill out the paperwork and we will make sure you qualify.
Well, it's
for
an
this
American
loan.
dream, right, to own a home.
It is an American dream to own a home, but it's also an American obligation to be able to afford to pay for that home. And the mortgage brokers, the subprime lenders, were in it for the short term. The brokers would get a commission, the lenders would front the money, turn around and sell the mortgage to investors. A lot of these subprime loans wound up, as we have learned over the last couple of years, in mortgage-backed securities, which are a bundle of mortgages. Some are very good mortgages, A-rated, some are medium-rated, and some are really subprime. Depending on the quality of the package, the investment should have been graded in a certain way. The investment houses, the securities analysts, Moody's and the rest, tended to look the other way on a lot of these mortgage-backed securities. They were traded on Wall Street as trust shares or otherwise. A lot of the shares were bought by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. Some of them were purchased by overseas investors such as Deutsche Bank. Most of them were insured by AIG. And when things started to unravel, when individuals who probably should not have had mortgages could not pay the mortgage because a lot of these subprime loans were teaser rates, interest only for the first 6 months, interest only for the first year. And then you're going to have to start paying the principal back. And then we're going to adjust the interest rate. And the interest rate adjustment is set by some factor such as LIBOR, London Interbank Offering Rate, or U.S. Treasuries, which are published in the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, and anyone can look them up, but nobody ever does. So the interest would start to increase, the principal would have to be paid, the monthly mortgage payment would go up.
Ballooning up on them constantly, right?
The people who were barely qualified to make an interest-only payment no longer could make the payment. They defaulted. And that got into a vicious cycle of defaults and mortgage foreclosure activity and auctions. And those mortgage-backed securities were bringing down investment houses such as Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs. AIG had insured those notes, and they were being brought down. In the summer of 2008, the Bush administration took extraordinary steps to bail out the banks, to bail out AIG, and to bail out Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which also had invested or had guaranteed many of those loans. And that was the blossoming, if you will, of the financial crisis, 2008.
Before we go on, can we just go back to in the local arena? There's different types of banks. There's banks that are either unions, credit union banks, or a community bank. How did they fare? Did they handle themselves slightly differently than the other mortgage lending services?
I am a big fan, Jim, of local banks, regional banks. I think they are the backbone of the financial world of this nation. And if I were in charge of everything, I would prohibit the larger banks from lending to individual homeowners. The local banks, and you can name them, Florence Savings Bank, Hamden Bank, Greenfield Savings Bank,
People's
you
Bank,
name it.
Yeah.
All of these banks, first of all, have a much stricter view of who is qualified to borrow money. And if somebody is granted a loan by these banks and they fall into financial difficulty, the banks take extraordinary steps on their own, in my experience, on their own, to bring the borrower in, sit down, face to face, across the desk. What's the problem? How can we work it out? We've got to work this thing out together because we're both in it together. The larger institutions, Bank of America, Citibank, Wells Fargo, PNC, and you can name the top 20, are not in it for the individual homeowner. They are in it for monthly profits, quarterly returns, annual reports. And if an individual homeowner falls behind, the computer starts generating the paperwork, notices of defaults, 150-day rights to cure, notices of the auction, etc. And there is very little human contact with the larger banks. And the limited human contact that I have had with the larger banks has been at the other end of an 800 number with an individual who has very little authority, if any. And each time I call an 800 number on behalf of a particular client, I get somebody different in a different office. It might be in Utah today and South Carolina tomorrow.
It's their calling services, basically. They're answering.
Absolutely.
And getting back, just so that we're clear, the local banks are also into making a profit, but in a holistic sense, they can't afford to lose a community. They can't watch a community erode from within. And that's what happens when you have large amounts of foreclosures. It ruins neighborhoods. It ruins potential investors coming into a community. And that's what I think. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see what's happening in Springfield and how do you dig your way back out of such a situation. Third largest city in the state, having being in financial control board from the state to be able to try to deal with some of the shortcomings. So it really is imperative on those banks to give back and to reinvest, the Community Reinvestment Act, if you will, of making sure that their community is not redlined, that is, everyone has a fair shot. But they didn't, from what you're saying, they require documents. They're not looking the other way saying, I'll just sign, yeah, I know you're good people, sign here. But we also have problems with some of our small banks being bought out, and so you lose you start in good faith, and next thing you know, your bank is now owned out in North Dakota, and or your mortgages and your bank's been bought out. So how do people? I mean, we always have to stay vigilant to know, and stay ahead of, but there's a lot to it. My question, I guess, really is to you is: so how do people, when they're turning around, a bank notifies them or a service that you're not making your payments, where do they turn? How do they end up with you, or where do they go for help?
It started with the Bush administration, but it was really modified and put in place by the Obama administration, a federal program that goes by the acronym HAMP, H-A-M-P, for Home Affordable Modification Program, and it's intended to modify an individual homeowner's mortgage if that homeowner is falling behind in payment. Not all of the banks or lenders or servicers participate in that program. It's a voluntary program set up by the federal government. The aim of the program is to have an individual homeowner pay no more than 31% of his or her gross income for principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. And if it's a condominium, you include the condominium, the association's fees in that. But the condominiums in this area are fairly rare. I've had one or two in the 13 months that I've been here. But it's principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. Taxes and insurance are beyond the lender's control. Taxes set by the municipality, insurance premiums set by the insurance company. The modification, therefore, comes through a reduction in interest or a forbearance in the principal. Okay. And in some cases, well, let me go back to the 31% of gross income. If a homeowner made $10,000 a year, their gross, the principal, interest, taxes, and insurance target is $3,100 a year. $30,000 a year is $9,300 a year. In order to reach that 31% of gross income, the servicer, the lender, the bank, and what I'm talking about here are really the larger banks, BAC Home Loans for Bank of America, are supposed to reduce the interest in increments down to 2% for the first 5 years. And if that does not get the monthly payment down to the 31%, pardon me, then they are supposed to stretch out the term of the mortgage, the time in which to pay back the principal, to as many as 40 years. And if that does not get it down to 31%, then the lender, the servicer, is supposed to take some of the principal and move it to the end of the loan. I had one in Springfield where because of the terms of the loan, they were highly questionable about how this loan came to be. It was $150,000 owed on the loan. The servicer agreed to take $53,000, put it at the end of the loan, charge the 2% interest on the $97,000 that was remaining for 5 years, then on the 6th year to 3%, the 7th year to 4%, and then from the 8th year to the end of the term, about 30 years, it was 4.5% or something along those lines. At the end of the term, the end of the 30 years, that $53,000 was due and owing. But the original loan was $150,000. Interest was only going to be charged on the 97. The monthly interest, or excuse me, the monthly payments that the homeowners made was cut in half. And the two adults in the home found that to be a very favorable circumstance. They got into the loan in highly questionable circumstances, as I alluded to. It was probably the subject of property flipping, and it was probably the result of a predatory loan. But because of some discussions and some correspondence, the lender was willing to go along with the homeowners paying about half of what they had been paying before. So the Home Affordable Modification Program, HAMP, is intended to provide that type of relief, not only in predatory lending circumstances, but in my experience, more often it applies to economic difficulties, where the homeowners, as I explained to you, an example of the husband who was a truck driver and the wife who was working in a manufacturing plant, their income was reduced substantially, and they got a loan along those lines.
So, I'm sorry, I missed, when did this program come into being, HAMP program?
The HAMP program came into being in February of 2009, after the Obama administration came in.
Okay.
It was a modification of the Bush administration's help for homeowners, H4H.
That's right.
The HAMP program and the H4H help for homeowners was all part of the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008, which brought us the TARP program, Troubled Asset Relief Program. And the Troubled Asset Relief was given to Goldman Sachs, AIG, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the rest of them. Mainly
commonly referred to as the bailouts.
The bailouts,
Okay.
yes. That was mainly during the Bush administration, and it was carried forward in the Obama administration.
Now, if I understand correctly about TARP and the bailouts, is that those organizations that you just mentioned, the large houses, they received 100% dollar for dollar that they lost, right, or they needed to come out of potential failure on the loan.
As I understand it, that's correct, except for Lehman Brothers, which was allowed to fail. After Lehman Brothers failed and the markets really quaked, the Bush administration, Henry Paulson and Ben Bernanke, and those folks decided that we're not going to let any others fail, and hence the bailouts of the other financial institutions, of AIG, which insured a lot of these mortgage-backed securities, of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which had invested in a lot of these mortgage-backed securities and guaranteed a number of these loans. And in fact, they stretched it into General Motors and Chrysler under the Troubled Asset Relief Program.
Most of it really had to do with the housing condition, the market, when it occurred, right? That most of the money was tied up. A lot of the money was tied up in these overextensions, if you will. It was the house of cards, and literally. But I just want to let you know we're right about 5 minutes left, and I didn't want you to end with it. Is there something that you think that's missing from this puzzle? We have a program that's kind of established to help homeowners, the HAMP program, but yet who's overseeing that? Or you come along and you're trying to help educate community residents and agencies that this is out there, but what kind of, is there success happening with this program? Is there a need for more people to know? Where are we?
In my mind, there is very limited success with the HAMP program and its affiliated programs. I think primarily because it's a voluntary program. When it was set up in the Bush administration, there was no compulsory, no obligation on the part of the lenders to modify any loans. That lack of obligation was carried forward in the Obama administration. The larger banks, to my mind, have incentives to foreclose, both through the HAMP modification program and because of guarantees by the Veterans Administration, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Federal Home Administration of loans that are out there, that if a bank, BAC Home Loans, which is a part of Bank of America, if they were to foreclose, they can turn around, hand the foreclosure deed off to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, Veterans Administration, and get 100 cents on the dollar on that foreclosure deed. The result is that the government, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the Veterans Administration, owns the property, and they, the government, are seeking to evict the former homeowner that the loan guarantee was set up to assist.
So basically, in simplistic terms, the banks in the houses were taken care of. They're guaranteed, and so even they either got their money and taken care of, they dumped the mortgages off to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac or others, veterans. So the government becomes now the bad guy after paying everyone off. They now are in the situation of now what to do with these foreclosed properties?
Yes. That's not 100% of the foreclosure circumstances, but it is a significant part of the foreclosure circumstances. The government, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are not government enterprises.
But they're insured by the government, correct? At this point,
well, they're not strictly insured, but because they held so many mortgages, so many loans were backed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that when they started to teeter and when they started to fall, the government had to step in. Treasury Secretary Paulson and Ben Bernanke and the Bush administration stepped in, took them over, set up a separate government enterprise, government agency to oversee those two entities and to support them financially. So every penny that the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are losing on these bad loans that are being foreclosed and the foreclosure deeds transferred to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, every penny of that money is coming out of the United States Treasury, not as a formal obligation by the government that was set up, the obligation set up decades ago, but because of the circumstances that transpired in the 2007, 2008 into 2009, where Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were on the verge of collapsing entirely.
So let me ask you, Frank, as we wind down here, you've had a little more than a year.
Yes, sir.
And I'm sure you're not leaving voluntarily. I mean, it's no longer funded. It was a one-year funding, as you mentioned, from the
That's correct.
The state's attorney general.
Yes, sir.
What do you foresee? I mean, are there things in place to help people? Are more organizations aware of this and giving counseling on this? How's this issue being dealt with?
Well, the HAMP program is set up for HUD-certified counselors to assist individual homeowners with their problems. And there are a number of very qualified HUD-certified counselors in the area, and they can carry the process forward to a certain point. They can help an individual homeowner file an application and process it. But my main work was when the banks, the lenders, the servicers were not following through with the modification, what transpires next. They do need a lawyer. There are no other lawyers at Western Mass Legal Services who are going to pick up this obligation as I see it. There's none in the foreseeable future. There are a few attorneys in the area who do it on a pro bono basis. I was speaking with one this morning who was very reluctant to take a case forward because of the amount of time and effort that is involved in it.
Well, that's unfortunate for both. We're out of time for not only this show, but that we're out of time for you to service this community. I want to thank you on behalf of the community, one, to make a very serious, complicated issue more understandable, and for fighting on behalf of so many people that need that. So, Frank, thank you so much for coming in today to help us with that, and I wish you the best luck as you move forward. Thank you for joining us, and please take a moment to go online and take our survey. Help us plan for the future here at Amherst Media. Thank you very much.